On a Tuesday morning in October of 1993, every farmer within 20 miles of Tama County, Iowa, knew that the Lindgren place had finally gone under. The diesel had run out, not just on one machine. The combine that Darren Lindgren had mortgaged his equipment shed to buy the grain cart, the tractor pulling the auger wagon. 3 pieces of iron sitting dead in the middle of a field that still had 40% of its corn standing, and a forecast that said rain in 36 hours. Not a soft rain, either. The kind of rain that turns a harvested field into a lake and an unharvested one into a disaster. Darren had driven to the co-op in Traer that morning and discovered that his fuel account was frozen, not overdrawn. His banker had called the co-op the night before. The details of why that happened are a longer story and not the one I'm here to tell you today. But what matters is this: Darren Lindgren stood in the co-op parking lot at 7 in the morning with a fuel account he couldn't touch, a combine he couldn't run. He was 44 years old, and he had farmed this ground his entire adult life. And for the first time in that life, he stood in a parking lot and did not know what to do. Next, he drove home. He sat at the kitchen table, and his daughter walked in from the barn smelling like mules. Let me tell you about Greta Lindgren, because you need to understand the girl before you can understand what she did, and you need to understand why people in Tama County still talk about the fall of 1993, the way they talk about weather events and funerals as a fixed point in time that divided everything into before and after. Greta was 17 years old that October. She was the second of Darren's 3 children, the only one who had ever shown any real interest in the farm itself, rather than the idea of the farm, and she had been interested in it in a way that made her father quietly proud and quietly nervous when equal measure. It was not in the equipment, it was not in the yields or the futures prices or the conversations at the co-op counter that her father and his neighbors had every morning over bad coffee. Greta's interest was in the mules. The mules had belonged to her grandfather, Einar Lindgren, who had farmed this same ground from 1931 until 1967, when he handed the operation to Darren and retired to a house in Traer, where he lived until 1989. Einar had kept 2 Belgian draft mules named August and Clara on the farm long after everyone else had converted entirely to diesel, not because he was sentimental and not because he was stubborn, though people said both things about him, but because Einar Lindgren had a philosophy about farming that he had tried to explain to his son and his son's neighbors and anyone else who would listen. And the philosophy was this: a machine that runs on fuel you have to buy is a machine that someone else controls. A mule runs on hay and water, and both of those things grow right here on this farm and always will. Nobody had listened to Einar Lindgren, not because he was wrong, but because diesel was cheap, and combines were fast, and the future was loud, and the old man's mules were slow, and they smelled, and they required a kind of attention that modern farmers had neither the time nor the inclination. When Einar retired to Traer, Darren had kept the mules because getting rid of them felt wrong somehow, like selling the dining room table. They lived in a paddock behind the machine shed. They ate hay. They did nothing useful for 22 years, until Greta. Greta had started working with August and Clara when she was 9 years old. Not because anyone asked that required mules. She had started because she had found her grandfather's harness hanging in the back of the machine shed, stiff with age and smelling of old leather and something she could not name, and she had asked Einar on one of his Sunday visits what it was for. Einar had spent the rest of that afternoon teaching her. He had come back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. For 3 years, until his health made the drive from Traer impossible, Einar Lindgren had taught his granddaughter everything he knew about working draft animals: how to fit a collar, how to read an animal's mood through the tension in its neck, how to speak to a mule in a way it understood, because a mule has a longer memory than a horse and a shorter tolerance for being lied to. When Einar died in 1989, he left Greta the harness, not Darren. He had written it into his will specifically, and the specificity of it had made Darren feel something complicated that he had never fully worked out. By 1993, Greta had been working August and Clara for 8 years. August was now 21 years old and Clara was 19. They were not young animals, but they were sound, and they were trained, and they were fed, and they were in better physical condition than most of the equipment in Darren's machine shed, because Greta had taken care of them the way her grandfather had taught her, which is to say, the way you take care of something you intend to keep. Now let me tell you about the harvest, because you need to understand what 40% of a corn crop standing in a field in October means in Tama County, Iowa. In 1993, Darren Lindgren farmed 480 acres. Of those, 320 were in corn that year. He had harvested approximately 190 acres before the diesel account froze. At the yields he was running that season, call it 155 bushels per acre, which was about average for that ground. 130 acres represented somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,150 bushels of corn. At the price corn was bringing that fall, roughly $2.15 a bushel. That was $43,322, $43,000, and a frozen fuel account. And a 17-year-old girl who smelled like mules. Darren did not ask Greta what she was thinking when she walked into the kitchen that morning. He told her about the fuel account. He told her about the rain. He told her about the combine sitting dead in the field. He told her these things the way a man tells his family bad news, which is flatly and without drama, because the drama is already in the facts, and adding more to it doesn't help anything. Greta listened. She sat across the table from her father, and she listened to all of it. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that Darren would repeat for the rest of his life at family gatherings. And in conversations with neighbors, she said, August and Clara can pull the picker. Now let me tell you about what happened next, because what happened next is the reason I'm telling you this story, and the reason this story is still being told. Darren Lindgren looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, and he did not laugh. I want to be clear about that. He did not laugh because Darren was not a cruel man, and he was not an ignorant man, and he knew enough about what his daughter had been doing in that paddock for 8 years to know that she was not making a joke. But he did something that was in some ways worse than laughing. He went quiet in the way that adults go quiet when a child says something they consider impossible, a quietness that contains the whole weight of experience and practicality and the world as it actually works, and he said, Greta, that's not how this works anymore, Greta said. I know how it works, Dad. I know how it works better than you do. She was not being disrespectful. She was stating a fact. And Darren knew it was a fact, which was part of why the quietness had happened in the first place. Let me tell you about the corn picker, because the corn picker is the third character in this story, and it deserves its own introduction. Einar Lindgren had purchased a new Idea model 2-row horse-drawn corn picker in 1947. He had used it with August and Clara's predecessors, a pair of Belgian mules named Bjorn and Sigrid, who are outside the scope of this story but who deserve a mention, until 1961, when he had relucted the Quan, went eventually to the combined system that Darren inherited. But Einar had kept the horse-drawn picker. He had kept it in the back of the machine shed under a canvas tarp, and he had maintained it the way he maintained everything, which is to say, carefully and without sentiment, but with the understanding that a well-maintained tool is a tool that still works when you need it. Greta had found the picker when she was 12. She had spent 2 summers going over it with her grandfather's maintenance, manuals which she had also found in the machine shed, and with the mechanical instinct that seemed to have skipped her father's generation entirely and landed whole in her. By 1993, the new Idea picker was in working order. Not showroom order, working order. The chains were sound. The husking bed was adjusted. The elevator ran clean. Greta had run it twice with August and Clara in the east paddock, just to see if the theory held. It held. She had never told her father any of this because he had never asked. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many times in your life has someone had the answer to your problem and you didn't know it because you never thought to ask? How many times has the solution been sitting in a machine shed under a canvas tarp while you stood in a parking lot trying to figure out what to do next? I'm not asking to make you feel bad. I'm asking because this story is not really about mules or corn pickers or frozen fuel accounts. It's about what happens when we stop looking at what we have and start mourning what we've lost. Darren Lindgren drove out to the field that morning to look at his dead combine. He stood next to it for a while. Then he drove back to the house. He found Greta in the paddock with August and Clara, and he stood at the fence for a long moment, watching her work, and then he said, "Show me." She showed him. The new Idea picker came out from under the canvas tarp for the first time in 32 years. August and Clara stood in the barn aisle while Greta fitted their collars and hames and traces with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, which she very nearly had. The harness that Einar had left her in his will was oiled and supple and fit both animals perfectly because Greta had kept it that way. The animals stood quietly. August was 21 years old and had been working with Greta since he was 13, and he had the stillness of an experienced animal who understands that the fitting of harness means work is coming, and that work is not something to be anxious about. Darren watched all of this. He did not say anything for a long time. They hitched the mules to the picker at 11 o'clock in the morning. Greta walked them out of the barn and across the farmyard, and down the field lane toward the standing corn, and Darren walked beside her, and neither of them said much. The corn was tall and dry, and the stalks rattled in the October wind. The sky was the color of old pewter, 36 hours of rain somewhere in that sky. Now let me tell you about what the neighbors saw, because the neighbors saw it and the neighbors talked about it, and what the neighbors said is part of this story, whether the Lindgrens wanted it to be or not. The Lindgren farm sat on a county road that carried a fair amount of traffic during harvest season. Grain trucks, equipment, farmers checking on each other's progress the way farmers do, which is by driving past and looking and not stopping, unless something seems wrong. Several of those drivers that morning saw Greta Lindgren walking a pair of Belgian mules hitched to a horse-drawn corn picker into a standing cornfield, and what they saw produced a range of reactions that ran from genuine puzzlement to something closer to pity. the one who talked about it most was Gene Crowley. Let me tell you about Gene Crowley because Gene Crowley is the other half of this story, and you need to understand him before you can understand what he said and why he said it and what it cost him later. Gene Crowley was 58 years old in 1993. He had farmed 800 acres in Tama County for 30 years, and he was good at it, genuinely good. Not just in the way that people say someone is good at something to be polite, but in the measurable dactymaze when they gave him their Outstanding Producer award in 1991. Gene had a John Deere 9600 combine that had cost him $148,000 2 years earlier. He had a GPS yield monitor before most of his neighbors knew what GPS was. Gene Crowley was not a man who did things the old way because he didn't know the new way. He was a man who had built his operation specifically and deliberately around the new way, and it had worked, and he was proud of it, and his pride was not entirely unreasonable. Gene Crowley drove past the Lindgren farm at about 1 o'clock that afternoon on his way back from the co-op, and he saw Greta and the mules in the field, and he slowed down and looked, and then he pulled over and got out of his truck and stood at the fence for a while. He was still standing there when Dale Sievert pulled up behind him. Dale Sievert farmed 600 acres 2 miles east and was Gene Crowley's closest neighbor and his most reliable audience. Dale got out of his truck and stood next to Jane, and they both looked at the field for a while. Gene said, "That's Darren Lindgren's girl." Dale said, "I can see that," Gene said. "She's got those old mules of Einar's hitched to a horse picker," Dale said. "I can see that, too." Gene watched for another moment. The mules were moving steadily down the row, and the picker was working, and ears of corn were going up the elevator and into the wagon that trailed behind. It was slow. It was unmistakably, undeniably slow compared to what a combine could do. But it was moving. Gene Crowley said, "Lord, have mercy." And he said it in the particular tone of voice that people in Tama County used when they witnessed something that was either very brave or very foolish. And we're not yet sure which. Then he got back in his truck. He stopped at the co-op on the way home. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the story of Darren Lindgren's daughter and the mules had made the rounds of the co-op counter, the grain elevator, and at least 2 farm kitchen tables. The version that Gene Crowley told was not unkind exactly, but it had a quality to it that the best storytellers in any small community know how to deploy. The quality of sympathetic dispy, the gentle shake of the head that says, "Can you imagine?" which is not the same as ridicule, Gene said. He felt bad for the Lindgrens. Gene said it was a shame about the fuel account. Gene said that girl was working herself half to death out there for what, maybe 15-20 acres a day at that pace? Gene said the rain was coming in 36 hours, and there was no way on God's green earth that a 17-year-old girl and 2 old mules were going to harvest 130 acres of corn before it arrived. And then Gene said the thing that got repeated most often. He said, "Einar Lindgren was a good farmer, and I respected the man, but keeping those mules was always a little bit of a fantasy. And now his granddaughter is out there living that fantasy, and the rain is going to come and wash it away, and that'll be the end of it. Sometimes the past is the past for a reason. Now let me pause here and ask you something again. Have you ever watched someone dismiss an idea not because they'd thought it through, but because the idea came from a direction they weren't looking? Gene Crowley was not a stupid man. Gene Crowley was, by every measurable standard, a successful and intelligent farmer. But Gene Crowley had spent 30 years building an operation around one set of answers, and when an answer came from a different direction, from a 17-year-old girl with a pair of old mules and a horse picker from 1947, he categorized it. He put it in the drawer, marked "Passed," and he closed the drawer and he went home to his 9,600 combine and his GPS yield monitor for our grain dryer, and he did not think about it again. Not that night, anyway. Let me tell you about the 36 hours that followed, because those 36 hours are the reason this story exists. Greta Lindgren did not stop at dark. This is the part that people in Tama County remember most clearly, because it was the part that was most visible. She had a kerosene lantern hung on the picker's frame, a detail that came directly from Einar's maintenance manual, which had a section on night harvesting with draft animals that Greta had read so many times she could recite it from memory. The lantern threw a warm circle of light that moved slowly through the dark field, and the sound of the picker and the mules and the corn going up the elevator carried in the cold October air for a considerable distance in every direction. Darren worked beside her. He drove the grain wagon to the elevator and back. He kept the animals watered. He did not fully understand what was happening, not in the mechanical sense because Greta understood the mechanics better than he did, but in the larger sense, the sense of what it meant that his daughter had spent 8 years preparing for a moment. He worked, and he thought about that, and somewhere around midnight, he stopped thinking about it and just worked. Greta's mother, Greta Lindgren, brought food to the field at 8 o'clock and again at midnight. Greta was a woman who expressed support through action rather than words, a quality she had in common with most of the women in the story, and the action she chose was sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, which was exactly the right action. At some point during that first night, Darren said to Greta, "How did you know the picker would still work?" Greta said, "Because I fixed it." Darren said, when Greta said, 2 summers ago and the summer before that. Darren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Greta said. "You didn't ask." They harvested to the night and through the next morning and into the afternoon. The mules worked in shifts. Greta had anticipated this and had arranged it, resting one animal while the other worked with a neighbor's draft horse that she had called about at 7 in the morning. A detail that demonstrated a level of operational planning that impressed everyone who heard about it later. The neighbor was Hilda Peterson, who was 73 years old and had kept draft horses her entire life, and who arrived at the Lindgren farm at 8:30 in the morning with her Percheron mare named Dolly and a look on her face that said she had been waiting for someone to call her for years. The rain arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon on Wednesday, the 13th of October, 1993. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Greta Lindgren and Augustin were on the last pass of the last field. Let me say that again because it deserves to be said clearly. When the rain arrived, they were on the last pass of the last field, not finished, not quite. They finished in the rain, the last 100 yards of the last row, the mules walking steady and unhurried through the beginning of the downpour, the picker running clean, the corn going up the elevator in the rain, and Greta walking beside August with her hand on his neck and her face turned up into the weather. They pulled the picker out of the field at 4:51 in the afternoon. 130 acres, 30 hours and 51 minutes. In the barn afterward, unhitching the mules, Darren Lindgren stood next to his daughter and did not say anything for a long time. The rain was loud on the barn roof. August stood with his head low, tired in the good way that a working animal gets tired, and Greta was rubbing him down with a cloth the way Einar had taught her, starting at the neck and working back. Darren said, "I owe you an apology." Greta said, "No, you don't," Darren said. "I should have asked." Greta said, "You asked when it mattered." This is the part of the story that Darren told at the Farm Bureau meeting, the part that made 40 farmers in a meeting room go quiet in a way that meeting rooms full of farmers very rarely go quiet. He told it straight without embellishment, the way he had experienced it, standing in a barn in the rain, listening to his daughter tell him that asking when it mattered was enough. He said he thought about that a lot. Now, let me tell you about Gene Crowley, because Gene Crowley's part of this story isn't finished. Jenin had harvested his own corn during those 36 hours, which he was able to do because his fuel account was not frozen, and his combine ran fine, and he had none of the problems that had stopped Darren Lindgren in a parking lot at 7 in the morning. Jenin finished his harvest on Wednesday afternoon just before the rain arrived, and he drove back to his farm feeling the particular satisfaction, and he did not think about the Lindgrens again until Thursday morning when he stopped at the co-op and heard the full accounting of what had happened. He heard it from Dale Sievert, who had heard it from Hilda Peterson, who had been there. Dale told it straight. 130 acres, 30 hours, the mules, the night harsting with the kerosene lantern, the last pass in the rain, the numbers. Jenin Crowley listened to all of it. He was standing at the co-op counter with his coffee cup, and he listened. And when Dale was done, Gene was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She finished," Dale said. "She finished." Then he set his coffee cup down on the counter and he said, "I need to go see Darren." He drove to the Lindgren farm that afternoon. Darren was in the machine shed doing the kind of post-harvest maintenance that never ends, and Jane pulled in and got out of his truck, and they stood in the machine shed doorways. Not quite inside, not quite outside the threshold, as a kind of neutral ground for difficult conversations. Jenna said, "I heard what your girl did." Darren said, "She did it," Jen said. "I said some things at the co-op on Tuesday that I'm not proud of." Darren said, "I heard," Jen said. "I'd like to talk to her, if that's all right." Darren thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "She's in the barn." Greta was in the barn. She was with August, who was still recovering from the long work of the harvest, and she was doing what she always did with August after hard work, which was sit with him in his stall and let him rest was the kind of animal who rested better with company. She was reading a book. She was 17 years old. Jenin Crowley came into the barn and stood at the stall door and looked at the mule, and then at the girl, and then at the harness hanging on the wall, which was the harness Einar had left her, oiled and supple, and hung with the care of something that would be needed again. Jenin said, "Your grandfather was a good man." Greta said, "I know." Gene said, "I told people at the co-op that keeping those mules was a fantasy." Greta looked at him. She was 17 years old, and she had just spent 30 hours harvesting corn in the dark and in the rain. And she looked at Gene Crowley with the particular steadiness of someone who has recently been tested. She said, "My grandfather used to say that a machine that runs on fuel you have to buy is a machine that someone else controls." Gene said, "He was right." Greta said, "He was right about a lot of things. People just stopped listening." Gene was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What would it take to learn? Not to do it the way you do it. I'm not going to give up my combine, but to understand it. To have something like it. As, He stopped and looked for the right word. Greta said, "A backup," Gene said. A backup. Greta looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come back on Saturday. I'll show you what Grandpa showed me." Jenna Crowley came back on Saturday, and the Saturday after that. He was 58 years old, and he was not a natural student of draft animals, and he said so, and Greta was patient with him in the way that her grandfather had been patient with her, not the patience of someone who is waiting for you to catch up, but the patience of someone who understands that some things take as long as they take, and that rushing them produces nothing useful. Let me tell you about what happened over the next several years, because the story doesn't end in a barn in October of 1993, and the ending matters. Greta graduated from high school in the spring of 1994. She had been accepted to Iowa State in the agricultural program, and she went and she studied there for 2 years, and then she came back. Not because she failed, because she had learned what she needed to learn, and the rest of it was available at home. She came back to the Lindgren farm in 1996, and she came back with notebooks full of research on draft animal agriculture, on integrated farming systems, on the economics of low-intro, on the economics of low-intro. She had a professor at Iowa State named Dr. Marcus Webb who had spent 20 years studying exactly these questions, and she had absorbed everything he knew. And then she had come home to apply it. Darn let her. More than let her, he asked her to. The conversation was short in the way that important conversations between people who understand each other are often short. He said, "What do you want to do?" She told him. He said, by 1998, the Lindgren farm had a working draft animal program integrated into a diversified operation that included corn, soybeans, a market garden, and a small heritage grain plot that Greta had started from seed varieties she had found in a box in the machine shed. The farm had reduced its purchased fuel consumption by 40%. The draft animals. August had died in 1997, at the age of 25, a long life for a mule, and had been succeeded by a pair of young Belgian mules that Greta had trained herself. Did the work that tractors were not necessary for: cultivation, light hauling, the kind of field work that a 200-horsepower tractor was profound overkill. The economics of it were not romantic, they were practical. The per-acre input costs on the ground that the mules worked were lower, the margins were better, the numbers said so, and Greta had the numbers. Jenna Crowley had 2 Belgian mares by 1997. He had learned to work them himself, which had taken longer than he expected, and been harder than he expected, and which he said was one of the most valuable things he had done in 30 years of farming. Not because the mules replaced his combine, but because learning to work them had taught him things about his land and his operation that he had not known. He didn't know. He said this publicly at the Farm Bureau meeting in 1999, in front of 60 farmers. He said it without being asked. Let me tell you about the Farm Bureau meeting, because the Farm Bureau meeting is where the public part of this story reached its conclusion, and the conclusion is worth describing carefully. Greta Lindgren was 23 years old in 1999. She had been invited to speak at the Tama County Farm Bureau annual meeting by the organization's president, who had heard about the 1993 harvest and about the work she had done since. Greta had agreed to speak, and she had prepared carefully, and she had brought her notebooks and her data and her grandfather's harness, which she had hung on a hook near the podium, because she thought it should be in the room. There were 60 farmers in that room. Most of them were older than she was. Most of them had heard the story of the 1993 harvest, in one version or another. Some of them had driven past the Lindgren farm in the years since, and seen the mules in the field and thought about it and said nothing. A few of them had asked Darren quiet questions at the co-op that Darren had answered by saying, "Ask Greta." Greta stood at the podium, and she talked for 40 minutes. She talked about her grandfather and about what he had understood about farming that the next generation had set aside in the rush toward efficiency and scale. She talked about the economics of draft animal integration, and she showed the numbers, field by field, year by year, and the numbers were not dramatic, in the way that dramatic numbers are dramatic. They were not about one miraculous harvest. They were about the steady accumulation of lower input costs. She talked about what the 1993 harvest had taught her, which was not that mules were better than combines, but that a farm with no backup but, no redundancy, no alternative was one frozen fuel account away from losing $43,000 of corn to a rainstorm. She said, "My grandfather built a farm that could keep running when the things you buy stopped coming. We decided that was old-fashioned. We decided efficiency meant depending on one system, one fuel source, one supplier, and when that one thing failed, we had nothing. The lesson isn't that mules are better than tractors. The lesson is that any farm that depends entirely on things it cannot control is a farm that is always one phone call away from standing in a parking lot wondering what to do next." The room was quiet when she finished. Not the uncomfortable quiet of an audience that doesn't know what to say, but the particular quiet of 60 people thinking at the same time. Gene Crowley was in the third row. When Greta finished speaking, he stood up. He was 64 years old, and he stood up, and he started clapping, and then the room stood up with him. Darren Lindgren was in the back row. He stood up last. He stood up slowly the way a man stands up when he is feeling something he doesn't have words for. And he clapped, and he did not look away from his daughter at the podium for a long time. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more scene, and it happens 12 years later in 2011, and it is the scene that tells you whether anything was actually learned. Greta was 35 in 2011. She had been running the Lindgren farm jointly with her father for 15 years, and the farm was in good shape. Not spectacular shape, not the shape of a farm that had gotten lucky or caught a good market at the right time, but the shape of a farm that had been managed carefully and thoughtfully and with a clear understanding of what it was trying to be. Darren was 62 and had begun the slow process of stepping back, which for farmers is never a clean process and is usually accomplished over a decade. Greta had a daughter named Sophie. Sophie was 9 years old in 2011, and she had been in the barn with the mules since she could walk, and she had her great-great-grandfather Einar's quality of paying attention to things without needing to announce that she was paying attention. One evening in the spring of 2011, Sophie came to the kitchen table with a notebook. Not Greta's notebooks, which were full of data and research and field records. Sophie's own notebook, which she had been keeping for 2 years without telling anyone. In the way that children keep things private not out of secrecy, but out of the instinct to develop an idea fully before submitting it to the scrutiny of adults. She put the notebook on the table and she said, "Mom, I've been reading about cover crops." Greta looked at the notebook. She looked at her daughter. Sophie was 9 years old, and she had her great-great-grandfather's eyes, which were the particular shade of gray that appears in old photographs of Scandinavian immigrants, and which seemed designed for looking at things steadily and without blinking. Greta said, "Tell me." Sophie told her. She talked about cover crops and soil health and the research she had found, some of it from the library in Traer, and some of it from the internet, which in 2011 was beginning to make the kind of agricultural research that had previously required a university library available to a 9-year-old in Tama County. She talked about nitrogen fixation and erosion control, and the economics of reduced fertilizer inputs, and she had numbers because she was her mother's daughter and her great-great-grandfather's great-great-granddaughter. Greta listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not say, "That's not how this works anymore," or "That's a nice idea, but," or any of the other things that adults say to children when they are not really listening. She listened the way her grandfather had listened to her, which is to say completely and without deciding in advance what the answer would be. When Sophie was done, Greta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much ground do you want to start with?" Sophie said, "Maybe 20 acres to see how it goes." Greta said, "Pick your 20 acres. We'll plant them this fall." Sophie picked her 20 acres. They planted them that fall with a winter rye and hairy vetch mix that Sophie had researched and Greta had reviewed, and Darren had looked at and said nothing about, though he had looked at it for a long time. The cover crops established well. The following spring, the soil on those 20 acres had a structure and a biology that the adjacent ground did not, and Sophie had the measurements to prove it, because she had taken soil samples in the fall before planting and again in the spring after termination. 20 acres became 40. 40 became the whole farm. Let me tell you what the Lindgren farm looks like today, because it is worth describing. It is 480 acres in Tama County, Iowa, on a county road that carries a fair amount of traffic during harvest season. It has a machine shed with a John Deere combine in it, because Greta is not her grandfather and she is not romantic about efficiency when efficiency is the right answer. It has a paddock behind the machine shed where 2 Belgian mules live, the 3rd generation of working animals on this farm, trained by Greta and now being trained by Sophie, who is in her early 20s and who has her mother's notebooks and her own notebooks, which has been oiled and maintained continuously since 1931, and which still fits in the back of the machine shed, under a canvas tarp, is a new idea model 2-row, Horney Ford drawed. Greta maintains it every year, whether she needs it or not, because her grandfather taught her that a well-maintained tool is a tool that still works when you need it. The fuel account at the co-op in Traer has never been frozen again. Einar Lindgren kept mules on this farm because he believed that a machine that runs on fuel you have to buy is a machine that someone else controls. His son thought that was old-fashioned. His great-granddaughter thought it was the beginning of a question, not the end of one. And his great-great-granddaughter is standing in a field right now with a notebook and a pair of Belgian mules and an idea that nobody in Tama County has tried yet. They'll probably laugh. The mules don't care, and neither does she.